Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on the outdoor storage of wooden pallets and are you in compliance with the new codes? Today's webinar is being put on by the National Wooden Pallet and Container Association and Koffel Associates. I am Brad Gething, the Director of Science and Technology Integration of the National Wooden Pallet and Container Association. I will be co-presenting this afternoon with Bill Koffel, President of Koffel Associates. I am the Director of Science and Technology Integration. I work on several issues. I am a technical subject matter expert for the wooden pallet industry, and among other things, I handle standards related activities. So just a little bit about today's audience. We have two audiences today that we'd like to welcome. One of them is the wooden pallet industry, so members, industry members who manufacture and recycle wooden pallets. And we also have the fire safety community, so fire code inspectors are also in attendance. One of the goals of our work is to enhance communication between the industry and the inspectors. So we hope today's webinar contributes to that, improving that effort. Just a couple of things, some notes on today's presentation. The presentation slides will be available on our website, palletcenter.com/firecodesafety. So that will be the actual recording of the webinar in addition to the slides. You can submit questions for the Q&A session throughout the presentation, so you don't have to hold them to the end. Feel free to use the question box to submit your questions, and we will be collecting and filtering those as needed throughout the presentation. And finally, there will be continuing education credit that Bill can address later on in the presentation. So just for today's presentation, I will be presenting some background and history of this topic, and then I will hand things over to Bill, who will be really diving into the details of the new codes and how to comply with them. And then finally, we will be having a Q&A session that we hope will have some good questions and some discussion on any kinds of questions you might have from the presentation. So we're starting with this core principle of NWPCA. And that is nothing is more important to the members of the National Wooden Pallet and Container Association than the safety of their employees, the people that live near their facilities, and the first responders. This is really a core tenet that we have at NWPCA, and this provides a solid foundation for us to build on as we discuss today's topic. This is really a guiding principle for the association and its members as they make decisions in their businesses. And for the code officials on today's webinar, some of this might seem a little rudimentary, but for the pallet manufacturers and recyclers, I thought it'd be useful to go through some terminology that you might hear in today's presentation, just so we're all on the same page. So there are two code bodies that administer building codes in the US. That is the International Code Council, or you'll hear me say the ICC. And then there's also the National Fire Protection Association, that's the NFPA. And they administer two different codes related to this issue of outdoor pallet storage. So for the ICC, it's the International Fire Code, or what's called for shorthand the IFC. And the NFPA code is the NFPA 1 code. And you also might hear us refer to inspectors related to the ICC. That's the code or fire official, and for NFPA, that's the authority having jurisdiction, or the AHJ. So with that being said, if you're a facility manager or a member of the industry, you might have a couple questions that you might realize right off the bat. And excuse me, I gotta go back to this slide. And those are which codes might apply to me. And it will actually be, there's a lot more to it than that. And Bill's going to go into more detail on this in his part of the presentation. But the idea of what code applies to me is not a straightforward answer as a facility operator. So I'm putting this out here to highlight that as a facility operator, you do need to do your due diligence in understanding which code actually applies to you. So diving into the history of this topic, really, we need to go back to 2013 to understand when this process began. When we look at the two different codes, in the ICC realm, there was no existing code language on the external storage of wood pallets. There was no existing language. For the NFPA, there is a very prescriptive code for idle, what was defined as idle pallets. And this was a maximum pile size of 400 square feet with 8-foot spacing in between, 50-foot spacing from the storage area, and a pile height maximum of 15 feet. And that question of all pallets are idle pallets, there wasn't really a strict definition on what idle pallets are, but basically it was just a pallet that wasn't being used to store goods or to transport goods. So in this case, many pallets stacked on top of each other would be considered idle pallets. And it didn't matter if you were a facility manufacturing or recycling pallets, or if you were a user of pallets, they were all defined as idle pallets. So if we look at the timeline of how things progressed from 2013, in the summer of 2013 is really where NWPCA became involved, as we learned about an ICC proposal in the 2013 to 2015 code cycle. So the proposal included provisions that were operationally very challenging to the industry. And so we recognized the importance of the proposal, but we requested a reworking. And the reason we requested that reworking is so we could commit to engaging in the process. And that did provide us some latitude with the committee. They understood that in the first round of the proposal that it might not be operationally feasible in some cases. So they did give us the latitude to come back to them with a working proposal. So that's exactly what we did. So in preparation for the next code cycle, starting in the spring of 2015, NWPCA began work with its standards committee to work on developing the proposal. So the NWPCA has a working standards committee, and it has experience for many years codifying industry practices. We codified a uniform standard for pallets, and had also been involved historically with ASTM standards. So this was a prime group to work on developing code language for the outdoor storage of wood pallets. And for the industry members out there, this is really important to note that the language that has been developed, that from the very beginning, it's really had significant input from your peers from the beginning. So this standards committee worked to put together a proposal in partnership with with Bill Koffel and his guidance, and we submitted that that proposal at the deadline, and then it was reviewed. And upon that review, we got a lot of feedback. So for the industry members on the line, it goes through. There's a very set process by which these codes go through review, and but the point is that we decided that we were going to work with both the ICC and the NFPA. We thought this was an excellent opportunity to work with a broad audience. So when we submitted these codes, our proposal to get review, we got input from both the ICC and even the IFCAC committee, and also the NFPA committees as well. So we really got broad input from the fire code community as well as to what we got right and what we didn't get right. And so that our proposal was approved, but we received a lot of comments, and we took those comments to heart and resubmitted our proposal based on the feedback that we got. And then in 2016, the final proposal was approved by both the ICC and NFPA. And then, based on editorial work and what it takes to put all those codes together, in 2018 we saw the publication of the new 2018 IFC and NFPA 1 that included the NWPCA authored codes. So Bill's going to dive into the details here in a minute or two. I just wanted to take a step back and point out a couple fundamental concepts in the new codes. The 2018 ICC and NFPA codes on outdoor pallet storage, they apply, these that we're talking about here apply specifically to manufacturers and recyclers of wood pallets. Idle pallets are now considered at separate parts of the code. So the ICC is a little different. There's an entire different section for idle pallets. For NFPA, there are just two different parts. It's in the same part of the code, but you just read on from one part to another based on your operation. And really, where this came about is for those of us in the wooden pallet industry, we view these pallets as an asset. There's no one making money in the pallet industry unless these pallets are moving. So as you can see in this picture, there are several forklifts here. These are moving pallets constantly. So this is really an actively managed environment where pallets are constantly in motion, and constantly under supervision, where as users of pallets, they just might have just a storage area where pallets sit for a while until they're finally transported. So we were able to make a clear distinction between those that manufacture and recycle pallets and those that use pallets. So another key concept is that, or a key thing to think about, is that the 2018 codes that just came out are performance-based rather than prescriptive-based, and this performance-based standard is really based on industry best practices that the industry has been using. So I mentioned that a lot of the groundwork came out of our standards committee, a task group in our standards committee, and again, the industry had significant input on this code language. It wasn't somebody who was outside of the industry, who didn't really know how the industry operates. These are really industry operators who came together and developed this language. So the NWPCA Standards Committee worked to codify these established best practices that have been implemented by the industry over time. And really, the significant part of this is that now this performance-based standard, there are some provisions in there to mitigate the spread, just as the prescriptive-based standard. But really, the heart of this of these codes is really to help prevent fires from happening in the first place. I I wanted to take one more opportunity here to kind of give a quick, PSA for the industry. Now that the new code's in place, we really need to see it through to its implementation. We at NWPCA are being very active in promoting the new codes, and now we need to the real work get started, and that's actually seeing the code from development now into implementation. And so this is what we're promoting from NWPCA, and these are either NWPC members, and we're actually non-members as well. As what we're promoting is that each industry facility find out which code applies to you. Bill's going to give you some great information on how to do that. We also are asking you to invite your code inspector for a site visit, and we're also promoting that the industry comply with the new code as soon as possible. So even if your local jurisdiction isn't enforcing this new code, we are advocating that every facility in the industry comply with the new code as soon as possible. And because of our dedication to safety, we think this is the best way to prevent any fire danger on your facility. So we're promoting that this get adopted as soon as possible. And finally, we're asking you to be an advocate. If you know of members in the industry who need help with compliance, or we can help them with that. So feel free to have us reach out to them, and also promote these concepts within when you're out talking to your peers. From an NWPCA staff standpoint, we're doing outreach and education to both industry and the fire code community. I think that speaks for itself. This webinar is a good example of that. And we've also developed some good compliance tools for helping the industry to comply. So I think Bill's going to give more detail on those compliance tools. So again, just to emphasize, outreach to your code inspector is essential, not just to learn what code applies, but it really promotes a proactive approach to fire safety. I know this can be a little uncomfortable, but I've had several conversations with industry members who have done this already, who have invited fire code inspectors for a visit, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. It really helps you to develop a partnership with your inspector, and again, I think it really helps demystify this process of learning new codes and coming into compliance. And then also, and really finally, successful industry-wide adoption and implementation is really vital at this point. This is a performance-based standard, and it is somewhat of an unconventional approach. You don't see as many performance-based standards out there in the fire, and when it comes to fire codes. And they're reviewed every 3 years, and changes can be made. There's no guarantee that a more prescriptive code can't be implemented in the future. So we really need to put our best foot forward here, and industry-wide adoption is important. And the reason that is because the industry in general is really everyone pulling on this rope at the same time. So if there are bad actors out there, they can really create a bad name for the industry, for the industry overall. So then the next cycle is in 2021, and these codes are living documents. So we could see changes in 2021 based on the fact that these codes aren't being successfully implemented, and they're not really leading us toward a more safe fire environment. So with that, I'm going to stop with the background part of things and turn things over to Bill Koffel. He's an expert in the field of fire code development and fire safety. He's extremely active in the development process of the industry's governing codes. and he was really instrumental in guiding NWPCA through the ICC and NFPA process, which led to the development of the new ICC and NFPA codes. We're really grateful to have worked with Bill and to continue to be working with Bill and have his guidance as we work to build industry compliance. So with that, Bill, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Brad. And just to pick up on some of Brad's comments, this really does represent a change in perspective in that the traditional requirements that Brad referred to were more of the basis of we have a fire or we may have a fire in our facility, and let's assign or have prescriptive requirements to try to manage that fire so that the fire department can control that fire upon arrival. This new approach is more of a risk management approach. And for those of you familiar with the traditional requirements, you'll see some relaxation of those requirements in this approach. But that's based upon the fact, as Brad said, it's restricted to manufacturing and recycling facilities. And in those facilities, the pallets are an asset. And they need to, they're not looking to have any significant loss of their inventory, and they're constantly moving this inventory. So the approach that we're going to take this afternoon is we're not going to go through the International Fire Code or NFPA 1 in detail. There's a few paragraphs that I have pulled from the codes, but really gets a better fundamental understanding of the concepts. As Brad said, these codes are changing. We're actually already through the first step in the development of the 2021 edition of the international codes. And there's been some minor tweaking, mostly editorial, to the provisions in the 2018 edition of the IFC that are related to outside storage at manufacturing and recycling facilities. With respect to NFPA, NFPA 1 has not yet started, well, the process has started in the sense that we're open for public input, but the committee has not yet held their meeting. They actually have a meeting next week, which is referred to as their pre-first draft meeting. But the public comment period is open till late June. And then after that, the committee will meet to address all the public input and or committee input with regard to this as well as other topics. So the code sections, whether we're talking the IFC or the NFPA 1 provisions, there's basically four major components to that code section. One deals with the site plan, another deals with the fire prevention plan, the third deals with the fire emergency response plan, and then finally the security plan. And we're going to walk through each of these conceptually. And then after I get through that, as Brad said, we will talk about the compliance manual, the outline of the compliance manual, how one can get the compliance manual, and so forth. So starting with a site plan, the code, and again, this list might change, be a little different between NFPA 1 and the IFC, or it might get changed a little bit in a future edition of the code. But basically, there's a list of items that the code identifies are to be on the site plan. And this list basically is providing information that a fire inspector will have available to them upon arrival at your site so that they can verify your compliance with the code requirements. There's also useful information, and you'll see me refer to that a couple times as we talk about this site plan. Many fire departments do something called pre-plan, and they will come out to sites and prepare for a fire incident by coming familiar with that site, maybe having an actual plan for that purpose. And a lot of those things are on this site plan, so you've already helped them in their pre-plan activity should your local department do a pre-plan activity. And basically, if we look at this list, what we're trying to do is take this photograph and convert it into a diagram or a map a plan that can be used for your management of the site as well as the emergency response personnel to have a better understanding of what's going on at your site. So this is an example of what that site plan might look like, and I've taken that list from the previous slide and condensed the verbiage down a little bit so that we can talk about some of these things. First off, there's not a requirement in the code that this site plan be drawn to scale. Again, ideally it will be relatively close to scale, but it doesn't have to be prepared by a land surveyor or a professional engineer or something like that. In most jurisdictions, I am aware that there may be certain states, I think state of Illinois might be one, that any code required plan has to be prepared by a design professional, but our concept was not that this had to be prepared by an engineer. Those of you that are working in facilities, you potentially have the capability of preparing this site plan, and ultimately it has to be of sufficient detail and accuracy to meet the requirements of the authority having jurisdiction or the code official, because it's going to be submitted to them, available to them, and they're going to approve whether this is an acceptable plan or not. So we start with the basic lot, and many of you probably already have this information. If you don't, it's generally available by public record. Depending upon your governmental system, it might be a county agency or a local town that you can go to, and you can get a plan that shows your particular lot. Then some of the things that we want to have added to this is utilities, and some of these may not necessarily be on the example that's on the slide. But utilities, where are some of the key utilities? Do we have overhead wires that we need to worry about, or either on the site or adjacent to the site? We ask for basically a general description of the building construction. Now, the code officials on the call are aware that the codes generally talk in certain types of construction, type 1, type 2, maybe 222 or 2A, depending upon the code we're dealing with. We're not necessarily, again, looking for that much detail. What the emergency response and the fire department basically knows is, am I dealing with a combustible construction building? Am I dealing with a building that's non-combustible? Does it have a fire resistance rating? So some basic construction features. So I remember when I was in the fire service, we often talked about things as being ordinary construction or non-combustible, wood frame. That's very acceptable. If the code official says, hey, I'd really like to see you tie this into construction types as defined in my building code, then that information is potentially available. Older buildings, it might be much harder to find. Newer buildings, you may have the occupancy permit, or you can go back and look at the building permit, and you can identify the construction type for your buildings. Next, what fire protection systems are available? Are these buildings protected with a sprinkler system? You'll see fire alarm panel a little bit later on the list. Do we have a fire alarm system in these buildings? If you have a sprinkler system, although not shown in this list, it would be nice to show where the fire department connection is. If there's a post indicator valve in the yard to control the private fire service main or the inlet to the riser for the sprinkler system, those would, again, be nice things for the fire department to know their particular location. Water supply. Where can the fire department go to get the water that they're going to need to fight this fire? On this particular diagram, we have locations of hydrants. Some of these facilities are in areas where there is not public water. And clearly, either there's not public water, or there may not be hydrants right on site. And one would hope that we don't have this type of situation. This is not a fire at a pallet storage facility. This is actually an apartment building in the Northeast. But you can see the challenges the fire department had to try to sustain a water supply when there's an active rail line between their source of water and where this fire is. So again, where are the water supplies? That would be all part of the pre-planning activity that the fire department would undertake. Are there areas on the site where there are hazardous materials that are being stored? So in this diagram, you see some hazardous waste and chemical storage facilities. You see a propane tank identified on the diagram. Again, now either from pre-planning or even during the incident, the fire department knows where some of these other hazards are and concerns that do they have to protect those hazards should the fire start to spread to those areas. Where are the pallets stored? Again, if I look back in the photograph, I can see distinct areas where pallets are being stored on this site. So now as the fire inspector comes and does an inspection of your site plan says pallets are being stored in a particular area. Are you holding to that agreement that the pallets, or what you say on the plans, that the pallets will be stored in a particular area? Do you have dust collection systems in any of the buildings? The access to the site. So very clearly defined on this site plan is where the fire lane is. Again, not only does that help the emergency response personnel, but the fire inspector comes on site, you've designated where the fire lanes are, they can verify that those fire lanes are being kept clear and that they're going to be able to use those during an emergency for fire department access. Smoking is always a hazard, a risk that we need to deal with. So are there designated smoking areas on site? A lot of facilities that I've been in, they don't allow smoking on most of the site, but they will have a designated smoking area. And then the fire alarm panel. And again, not only the control panel for the building, but if you have a remote annunciator that's accessible to the emergency responders and gives them an idea of what's going on with this fire alarm system, it would be good to show those as well. So again, just an example of the reason why we might be concerned with and want to deal with the water supply issue. So that's the site plan. The expectation of the code is that the site will prepare it. When the fire inspector is out, or as Brad said, we encourage you to ask them, invite them. Prior to being a consultant, I was with the Maryland State Fire Marshal's office, and I want it to be considered a resource. There's a lot of talent in your various code enforcement agencies, and utilize them. They can help you determine what really needs to be on this site plan, what they're concerned with, and help you with maybe even some of the terminology that's used in the code or the compliance manual that you might not be familiar with without their assistance. So that's the site plan. The second part of the code change talks about fire prevention plan. So I mentioned earlier that the concept with this code package is that you are managing the risk, and that we're not only just trying to locate the pallets so that the fire department can control the fire should the fire occur, we're taking steps to try to prevent the incident from occurring in the first place. So there are four major parts of the fire prevention plan that we'll talk about and the code requirements talk about. One is walkthrough inspections. A lot of the facilities I've been to on a daily basis, maybe multiple times throughout the day, somebody is walking the site and they're looking for hazards. They're making sure that everything is being done in accordance with the policies and procedures for that particular site in terms of preventing the accumulation of dust and good housekeeping. Again, the location of the pallets. And this is not just a fire walkthrough. That's what we're going to focus on since we're talking about fire code requirements, but just from a safety compliance. Brad mentioned the association objective of providing a safe workplace. So this walkthrough would not be solely for fire issues, but other safety compliance issues. We'll talk a little bit about hot work permit process, the preventive maintenance program for the fire protection systems and equipment that you have, and then what are some of these basic storage requirements. So the responsibility for managing this risk rests with the operator of the facility. The code official is really merely coming in and saying, yes, I think your program is acceptable or not. You're doing what you need to do in terms of your inspections, your hot work permit process, inspection, testing, and maintenance of your fire protection equipment, and you're meeting the requirements for the storage. So what the inspector might anticipate or hope that they would find as they arrive on at your facility is that you may have a series of binders or manuals that will go into a variety of different things. You see a manual on hot work. You see a safety manual. You see a manual, in this case, that deals with the emergency evacuation plan, which is actually the third thing we will talk about, and the inspection, test, and maintenance. And the other thing that I liked about this particular location is that part of their safety program wasn't merely to look at the incidents that have occurred and how we might be able to prevent those, but what are the near misses? What are the things that we were able to catch, we were able to prevent? And again, is there something we should be doing to try to even prevent the near miss from occurring? On the right-hand side, you see a hot work permit. If you're going to have any welding operation, the code is typically going to require that you need to get a hot work permit, or you need to have a hot work permit process. Who do I go to get this permit? Who is coming out to the site to make sure that we've set the site up safely and we're not likely to have an ignition of combustibles, and we don't have combustibles in close proximity to where this hot work is going on? Do we have portable or other fire protection equipment should we get an ignition? And do we have a fire watch or somebody overseeing this activity as it's going on? So that would be all part of my hot work permit process. Again, we'll come back and talk about the manual. It will have examples of how one might implement each of these fire prevention strategies. Good housekeeping is key. And prior to my involvement with NWPCA, I really did not have a good understanding or appreciation of this industry. What I found as I went to these facilities is I was amazed at how clean they were, how well kept they were, how basically free of dust and debris and clutter. For the type of work that was going on in these manufacturing and recycling facilities, for them to be as clean as what you see on the left, and I'm not saying what's on the right is not acceptable. We are going to have debris, and we can see that for the most part, they've tried to collect this in one location. We can see a small amount of dust that is accumulating. NFPA has a standard, multiple standards, as a matter of fact, on combustible dust and managing that risk. We go into that in the compliance manual. There's going to be a presence of dust in these facilities. The real question is, do we have a quantity of dust that is accumulating that could present a significant hazard in terms of a dust explosion or a sudden spread of fire as a result of rapid spread of fire, I guess I should say, as a result of the dust that's present in these facilities? And for the facility folks, recognize that the first impression is one of the few things that you never get a second chance at in life. So when that fire inspector walks into your facility, if he or she sees what I have shown in a photograph on the left side of the slide, their immediate reaction is, this is a well-run facility. They're probably, I still need to do my inspection and I need to do my verification, but they're probably doing what they need to do. If they see a lot of clutter and dust, that's the immediate, I need to look at this a little bit more carefully because maybe they're not doing everything that they should be doing. Outdoor storage. So we set on the site plan. The site plan is to identify where the outside storage is to be located. And the major focus of this code change was not what was going on inside the buildings, like we just talked about, but really what is permitted in terms of outside storage of these pallets. Again, I want to emphasize these sections deal with the outside storage at manufacturing and recycling facilities. Even the ISC now has a section that deals with the idle storage of pallets at other locations. And really, the way both of the codes are written, you have the option of doing either. You know, if you as a facility say, you know, I'm really not prepared to do all this fire prevention plan and all these activities, the codes are written to say, fine, go back to what was previously in, you know, what Brad said was in earlier editions of NFPA 1. It's still there, and it's now in the ISC as well. You know, here's a more prescriptive approach of just, you know, limit your pile sizes in area, limits the height of the piles, and so forth. But in this approach, we're giving a little bit more latitude as to how big these piles may be, how tall these piles may be, because again, it's an asset, it's something the facility needs to control and manage, and that they've implemented these risk management strategies in the normal day-to-day operation of the facility. So in this instance, I actually have taken some text. I took some text out of NFPA 1, 2018 edition. The text in the ISC is essentially the same. And you will see that there are some limitations with regard to the stack height and the proximity that the stacks may be towards a property line. You know, so not only are we concerned about controlling the fire on the site, we're even more concerned to make sure that this fire doesn't spread to any adjacent property or exposures. So you see in 3410.4.6 that unless permitted by, and I put that other paragraph in on the lower part of this slide, there's actually a typo. If any of you are looking at NFPA 1 2018 edition, you'll actually see that these paragraphs refer to 3410.4.11. They should refer to 3410.4.12. But having said that, you know, unless I do this other approach, the stacks of pallets should not be stored within 0.75 times the stack height or a minimum of 8 foot, whichever is greater. So I'm going to start at 8 foot. And if I want to have a pile that goes higher than what the old method might have allowed, I'm going to be into this 0.75 times the stack height in terms of how far apart, how far away from the property line I need to be. Where did that number come from? Well, that was really research that Brad did. He looked at, you know, if a pile starts to fall or collapse, it doesn't necessarily fall from the lowest pallet on the pile. So if my pallet is, let's say, 16 feet high, if the pile is 16 feet high, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to have on the ground if this pile collapses horizontally, I'm going to have 16 feet of pallets. It's actually going to rotate from an elevation slightly above the bottom. So in the case of a 16-foot high pallet, his work said, you know, we're probably not going to have a horizontal distribution of pallets more than about 12 feet. So let's be that far away from the property line. Same thing in terms of important building on site. Now, what's an important building on site? We actually took that terminology from NFPA 30, which deals with the storage of flammable liquids. And it defines important buildings as, you know, my operational facilities, buildings that are necessary to keep the site going. So your manufacturing or recycling facility, a building where you might have some indoor storage of pallets and things like that. I have a shed in my yard somewhere where we have some yard maintenance tools, brooms, whatever. That probably isn't an important building on site. But the important buildings on site, again, we want the pallets to be away from the building so that we don't get basically direct spread of the fire from a collapsed pile to that building. Now, one of the big changes you'll see is in 3410.4.8. And instead of having the height limited to 8 feet, like earlier editions of the code had, we're going to allow the pallet stacks to be up to 20 feet high. And you see some of these here in this photograph. Now, where did the 20 feet come from? That was really an operational consideration. These pallets are typically trucked from the site to another location. The typical height of the pallet load that's going to be on the trailers that you saw in Brad's photograph is 9 feet, and that's for clearance issues on highways and so forth. So we went to 20 feet to give you a slight additional height. I think in reality, you're likely to find that most of those piles will be in the vicinity of about 18 feet. Again, that's 2 stacks that will get loaded onto a trailer. Now, what is 3410, 412 all about? So both NFPA 1 and the IFC have in Chapter 1 some language that allows me to do something in a way different than what the prescriptive requirements of the code are. In NFPA 1, we call it an equivalency paragraph. In the ICC, we refer to it as an alternative method of compliance. And basically what they say is that you can do almost anything you want as long as you provide an equivalent level of safety and it's approved by the code official or the authority having jurisdiction. Well, we wanted to build that concept right into this package to more specifically say that, yeah, we have some prescriptive requirements here in terms of distances to property line and distances to important buildings and the height of the pile and so forth. But the authority having jurisdiction, since this is from NFPA 1, it's using NFPA language, the authority having jurisdiction is permitted to allow stacks to be closer to the property line or a structure where there's some additional fire protection that's provided to address the risk. And that's now going to be at the discretion, the judgment of the code official or the authority having jurisdiction. And that might be that there are some more specific design arrangement details that are associated with the risk management on site. Maybe there's some supplemental fire protection systems, detection systems. And I know that's tough to do in the outside yard, but there are ways to do automatic fire detection exterior to the building. Maybe I provide more than what's required in terms of fire department access roads so that they have even better access to the storage areas. Therefore, manual suppression activities can be more effective and can be implemented more quickly. So we've given some criteria that the authority having jurisdiction might be able to use to offer some additional allowance. And while this could apply to new and existing buildings, I think one of the things that the NWPCA committee felt was important about this section is with existing buildings, the site is already defined. And there may be the need for some additional latitude for those existing facilities as compared to I'm creating a new facility, I'm looking for a piece of land, how I lay out the buildings and the storage on the land, I've got a lot more flexibility with that. And again, this doesn't limit this to existing buildings or existing sites, but certainly would have application on existing sites. And we felt it important to identify in the proposal what are some of the things that might be considered when looking at an alternative compliance method or equivalency as compared to just a general paragraph back in Chapter 1 that says, well, as long as it's equivalent, it's okay. So we're trying to give some guidance to the code official and the authorities having jurisdiction, say, here are some things to think about when you start looking at these alternative methods. So our third area is the fire emergency response plan. And what are your procedures for reporting fire emergency? How is it reported? And I would hope that in this plan, basically the concept is the moment we become aware of a fire, we are going to report it to the fire department. Time is going to be of the essence. And, yes, I'm not saying that it's wrong to maybe have some part of this plan where you're going to have personnel who are trained to use portable fire extinguishers, or I know some of the facilities have hose lines out in the yard that can be used by some of their personnel. That's fine. But the message I'm trying to deliver today is don't try that first and then call the fire department. I would hope that your emergency plan, and I'm sure for your local code official to approve that plan, it's going to have to be upon discovery of fire, the fire department is notified immediately. Here's how we do it. Is it dial 911? Here's a more traditional approach on this slide. You don't see it in a lot of parts of the country where I actually have a box that ties into a municipal loop and the fire department gets notified. It's the old box system that you see in a lot of the older cities. But today with cell phones and so forth, I would think that the protocol most likely is you see a fire, you dial 911. And there's other things you're going to want that person to do also to implement your emergency plan. What training do you offer to your personnel? If you expect some or all of your employees to use portable fire extinguishers, are you educating them or training them in the use of portable fire extinguishers? If you do have those hose lines, there's some OSHA considerations to worry about. OSHA defines an incipient level fire and a structural fire, and you may be required to have protective equipment and breathing apparatus and some additional training for people if they're doing more than just trying to fight an incipient level fire. What are the evacuation procedures? Again, I would hope that if there's a fire in the building, the procedure is that the employees are to evacuate and evacuate upon activation of the fire alarm system or however they become aware of this fire. What fire drills do you run? In this type of occupancy, the codes are going to be pretty lax in terms of fire drills. It's not like a hospital where they're required to run quarterly fire drills on each shift. But you, as the operator of the facility, look at the drill as an opportunity to educate your staff. Look at the drill as an opportunity to evaluate whether your fire plan is going to be effective or not. Do you really have the personnel to implement whatever procedures you've identified in this fire emergency response plan? And then the last part of the code change deals with security. If we look at the fire incidents that have occurred in any type of pallet storage, whether it's recycling, manufacturing, or otherwise, a fair number of these fires have been caused by unauthorized access to the site, what we're going to call an incendiary or arson type fire. So what are you doing to try to control that? And one of the things I want to make sure is clear, because as we distributed drafts of this compliance manual, there was a lot of concern that, this is telling me I have to have a security system or that I have to have cameras on site or something like that. No, it's not. The code language, the manual doesn't say you have to have any of this. What it says is you have to have a plan to deal with security. So what that generally means is you're going to do a vulnerability assessment. Where am I vulnerable? What's the area in which this site is located? I know I went to one site and they said, the local fire chief, he's a police officer, and when he's on duty at night, he makes sure he comes by this site at regular intervals. Well, that's part of their security plan. A lot of you may not have that same luxury. So what are you doing to address access to the site or limiting access to the site so that you're not likely to have that incendiary type fire? So that kind of gets us through conceptually the four basic components of this change. And I would hope that having gone through that, we would all agree that this is more about risk management than the traditional code requirements that did not discuss really any of this and just simply said piles will be limited to this size, this area, be a certain distance away from the building, and so forth. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the additional tools that are available to us beyond the code itself. So Brad referred to this. when NWPCA came into this process, they made a commitment to the code officials at both the NFPA meetings and the ICC hearings and meetings that we're going to develop tools that are going to help our membership and really not just their membership. You'll see in a moment that these resources are not limited to NWPCA members only. I don't have to be a member to get access. Everybody on this webinar can go to this website that we're going to give you. Brad already gave it to you. Go to this website and download this document for free. They are making it available to anybody who's interested. And I'm going to talk about what that resource is. So they had developed a site specific to this issue. In addition to the manual, there's a frequently asked question portion of this site. So as questions come in to Brad or somebody contacts me, I'll email Brad and say, here's a good question. You might want to consider putting it up on the site. The questions that are asked during this webinar, NWPCA is going to go through those questions and say, this is one we should probably put on the site. This is a good resource for everybody. So NWPCA is making resources available. The primary resource that we were talking about today is this Fire Code Compliance Manual. And the 4 concepts that I just talked about are all addressed in this manual. As an outline of the manual, there's an introduction. We'll go through what that is. There's a supervisor's guide. There are some specific examples, and there's an appendix. And I'm going to focus on the examples just for a moment. I'll come back to it later. We were able to get facilities to provide to us examples of their hot work permit procedures, their evacuation plans, their inspection checklists or inspection plans. So, look at those, take those, customize them, modify them to your site, and create a tool that's really going to work for you. So in the introduction, we give a basic outline of the manual. As Brad said earlier, there's language in this manual that is encouraging the facility to reach out to those of you that are fire inspectors, reach out to fire inspectors, use them as a resource, invite them to your location, and make use of that resource. Brad talked briefly about what code applies, and he had this map up. Please, please, please look at this map as a very generic map as to what code might apply to your facility. It is far more complex than we can show in any particular map like this. You have certain states that are color coded there, saying they're an NFPA state or an ICC state, or they use both. It can vary, and I'm going to use the state of Maryland as an example. We have a Maryland State Fire Code. It is a minimum code. It happens to be based upon NFPA 1. Our building code is the ICC building code, but the fire code is NFPA 1. It is a state adoption, but individual counties can adopt their own county code as long as it is at least as restrictive as the state code. So while I could sit here and say the state of Maryland is using NFPA 1 2015 edition, that might not apply to every county. And then if I further want to compound the issue, the state of Baltimore, or the city of Baltimore is exempt from the state code. They have their own code. So for any of us to sit here and say, well, yeah, you're in this state, go to this code, and then which edition of the code? So, we're talking about the 2018 edition of the code. There's probably no state currently using the 2018 edition, and I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. They're using 2015, 2012, 2009, maybe even 2006 edition of these codes. So you need to find the edition of the code. And then your municipality may even have some other special requirements. I'm aware of certain jurisdictions that have adopted their own requirements for the outside storage of pallets based upon some experience they've had, whatever. Now, going back to the edition in this 2018 edition, Brad indicated in his opening comments that the association is encouraging you to comply with these requirements? Well, if you are in an ICC state, that's probably going to be a little bit easier to do than if you're in an NFPA state right now. Because as Brad said, prior to the 2018 edition, there really were no requirements in the ISC that specifically addressed the outside storage of pallets. So you could take the 2018 edition and present to your code official to say there's really nothing in the 2012 or 2015 edition. It is addressed here in the 2018 edition. We want to comply with this. And again, they would have to approve it. Conceptually, that's an alternative compliance method under an older edition of the code. But they might likely look at that and say, yes, that's better than what's in the older edition. Now, with NFPA 1, as Brad said, there is existing language for the outside storage of pallets. And it basically applies to any outside storage facility. So if I'm in an NFPA state and my state or jurisdiction is under the 2012 or 2015 edition of NFPA 1, I really need to reach out to the code official and say, there's something new in the 2018 edition. Will you allow us to use this as the basis of the requirements that are going to apply to our facility? And as Brad indicated, regardless of your scenario, the association is encouraging you to implement these new requirements, whether you are required to do so or not. One, we think it's in the best interest of your business. Two, it's in the best interest of the industry as a whole. These codes tend to be reactionary, and if we have some significant loss experience in these facilities, that could conceivably impact what a future edition of the code might contain. And sometimes it's hard to really address, were they in compliance with the requirements of 2018 or were they not? We think that compliance with the 2018 edition of these codes is going to offer a better fire history for these types of facilities. So we're asking you to reach out, find out what you are legally required to do, and then entertain the code official in that discussion about, can I use this newer edition of the code? The second section of the manual really applies to the facility folks that are on this webinar. It gives you a summary, daily reminder. What are some of the things that you should be thinking about every day from a fire safety standpoint? And then there's some more detailed information on the major sections, somewhat similar to the discussion I had earlier in this webinar, where it will walk you through some of the various requirements and what is meant by the site plan and the emergency response plan and the fire prevention plan and so forth. Then we get into the third part of the manual, the examples. So there's an example of a site plan. As I said, we were able to get material from facilities. It's not Brad or I or somebody sitting in an office somewhere saying, oh, this is the way to do this fire prevention plan, or this is what the checklist should be. These are ones that the people in the industry are actually using today. And many of them were put in place before these code changes were these code requirements were put into place. So people were already using this risk management approach. We've just been able to codify it into the ISC and the NFPA 1. And then in the appendix section, there's a deeper dive. So there's material that we've taken from or we reference in certain NFPA standards, for example, dust collection. I mentioned that there's several NFPA standards that deal with the hazards associated with combustible dust. We go into that. We go into some of the hot work permit requirements in the NFPA standard. So there's a further discussion about some of these reference, and I refer to them as reference standards. They weren't specifically referenced in our language, these particular sections, but if I go to other parts of the fire code, I'll see a section that deals with hot work permits and so forth. So we tried to provide some of those tools available to you in this manual as well. So how do you get this manual? Brad had this on his slide. There's the website. Again, these, as Brad said, these slides will be up, available for you to download tomorrow. So if you don't quite get that website now, don't worry about it. It will be available to you in the handout for this particular webinar. And as I said before, this manual is available to all of you. You do not need to be an NWPCA member. You do not have to be somebody in the industry. If you're a fire official and you'd like to see what industry is telling their folks, download the document. I will say that during the development of this document, we did hand out an initial outline at one of the ICC hearings. We actually did a presentation at the ICC conference in Columbus saying, here's where we are with this manual. These are the things we're talking about. Just like we reached out to the industry folks to say, here's an initial draft of the manual. Does this work for you? What should be in here that's not in there? What's in here that shouldn't be in there? So we sought input from both the fire official community as well as the industry as to what should be in this manual. I would say that, this was our first attempt, and, this could be a second edition in the future as we get comments back from people, again, things that they would like to see added to this manual. We've tied it to the code changes, but again, somewhat like this webinar, it's a little bit more conceptual so that, if a number gets tweaked in the code change, it doesn't automatically make this manual non-compliant. Don't look at this as what ICC calls the commentary on the fire code, or NFPA calls the handbook on their code, where they specifically go through every paragraph and talk about that paragraph. We've really talked about the approach, the specific number, if it's 8 foot or 20 foot. Yeah, that may or may not change in future editions of the code, but the concept is addressed in this compliance manual. So again, this is free to everybody, available for you to download. So a couple of summary comments before we go into our question and answer session. At the end of this webinar, you're going to get a pop-up survey. We're interested in your feedback as to whether this met your expectations, your needs, things that we could have done, didn't do, things that we did do that we didn't need to do. It will also be sent to you by email. So if you've got a commitment coming up at the end of this webinar, you'll get an email with an opportunity to respond to the survey as well. The handout material will be up on the palletcentral.com website tomorrow. I don't know exactly what time tomorrow, but it'll be up tomorrow. So that's why I put on the slide after May 25th. So take advantage of the holiday weekend. Maybe come back next Tuesday and the handout material should be there. For those of you that need continuing education units, maybe as you're a certified fire official, that certification requires continuing education units, or for whatever reason, if you need a specific certificate saying that you participated in this 90-minute webinar, we will provide that to you, and hopefully that will satisfy any continuing education units requirements that you might have. And with that, it's now really time for us to try to respond to maybe some more specific questions that have come in during this webinar. So I'm going to turn it back over to Brad in terms of kind of moderating the questions that have come in. Brad? Brad, do you have any questions?
There we go. Sorry, I was muted there for a second. Yeah, we did get some questions that come in here, and I think this first one is kind of a good one to start with. And I'm gonna pass this question to you, Bill, because of your experience. But someone asked, if a fire starts in their yard, how do they know, how to, they have training in terms of, what notice to do, what notice to give, But in terms of, do they try to fight the fire? Do they not? What guidance can we give them on that? Or what guidance should a facility be giving their personnel in that case?
So I would probably start, in the answer to this, I would probably start with, first off, reviewing the OSHA requirements, because there are specific requirements as to what alternative you choose, what your expectations are of your employee. If your direction to your employees are to evacuate, that's what they need to know. And you don't need to get into education or training on portable fire extinguishers, protective equipment, or anything like that. If you decide, if your plan says, I want my employees to try to fight the fire first. And again, there's no single right answer here. Things that I might consider in choosing what approach I'm going to take is, what is the response time of the local fire department? I know some of these sites are pretty remote locations, and again, these are assets. Maybe you want to invest in the training to at least have some of your employees capable of fighting that incipient level fire. I also know that, just as I was a volunteer firefighter, some of these facilities employ volunteer firefighters, and they may already have some of the necessary training, so that you're really now at the point of providing the necessary equipment and tools for them to fight the fire. If you actually get into dealing with larger fires, what OSHA would deal with as not being an incipient fire or a structural fire, again, I just caution you that there are some very specific requirements to protect that employee. So that's number one, protect your employee. Yes, the pallets are an asset, but that employee is an asset also, and you need to take that into consideration. Again, reach out to your fire inspector, and they can potentially help you with some guidance to say, based upon your location, our response time, maybe it would be a good idea for you to train your employees to deal with incipient fires. The wastebasket fire, not a 20-foot high pile of pallets burning, but a small fire somewhere that we can control with a portable fire extinguisher. So there's really no single answer to that, but rather you've got to look at the risk and the risk both of what the fire is going to present and the risk to your employees, and determine what's the best approach for you.
Great. The next question I'm going to toss to you as well. It's very specific to the code. So this is the NFPA code, but in both cases, I'll just generalize it. How do these codes apply to storage of units of raw material?
So actually, they do not. This really talks about the pallet storage, the pallets themselves. So in a lot of these facilities, there is going to be source materials, raw lumber, and recognize that raw lumber is a different hazard than what the pallet is. The pallet presents an interesting fire challenge because you have a lot of surface area, you have vertical and horizontal areas for air movement. That's much different than a solid pile of lumber. So both of the codes do have separate provisions that deal with lumber storage, and you would really go to those sections. You'll find in most cases the requirements are less restrictive than what you're going to see for the pallets, because again, it's a different fire problem.
Excellent. The next question I think is a good one, and it's something for us to consider, and I think this is really between NWPCA and Bill, maybe the next time we're all together. It's how can we best communicate the severity of the exposure of stacked idle pallets to our customers? So I think this is a good one in terms of, we've done a lot of hard work here from working on fire safety from a facility standpoint, but then I do think as stewards of fire safety now related to wood pallets, that we do have, to think about how we pass this information on to those that use pallets. So I think this is something that NWPCA, the Standards Committee, can look at, and how we might communicate this to those that use pallets as well. Yeah, do you have any other thoughts on that, Bill?
No, I mean, again, the storage of pallets presents a very significant fire hazard in terms of fire growth rate. And, if you look at certain documents like NFPA 13 for a warehouse, and they talk about the storage of idle pallets in a warehouse, if I were to make a general statement, I would say that NFPA 13 is encouraging you to store those pallets outside of the building, recognizing that can't always be done, and recognizing that sometimes it's not done. Yes, it provides sprinkler design criteria for the storage of those pallets inside the warehouse. So there are some other applicable code requirements, but yeah, that's an idea. I can think of some video that's available that would just show, the initial stages of a fire in a pile of pallets.
Great. The next question: what about wooden crate manufacturers? And so, to my knowledge, the code as it's written currently applies to just pallets. I mean, is it possible that this language could be applied to crate manufacturing as well?
One of the things we have found since we developed this language is other people wanting to potentially jump on board with the work that we did. Everything that we did was based upon wood pallets. The plastic pallet industry has attempted to join in. They were more successful in the NFPA code activity than they were in the IFC, at least so far. And, wood crates, again, it's a different situation. The fuel is actually less concentrated in a wood crate. The pass of air movement or hot gases is going to be different in the wood crate. If I were looking at the storage of wood crates, I might want to think that there should be a different set of requirements for those as compared to the pallets. I think for everybody on the call, recognize that what was done to create these two sections in the NFPA 1 and the IFC was all based upon the history and issues around the wood pallet industry. Trying to apply this to something else, I really would need to have an assessment done or approval by the code official or authority having jurisdiction to allow me to do so.
And I'll just dovetail on that. This question was to open crates, and the thing about the crating industry is just that the variability is much greater. I mean, you can have open crates. I mean, would that apply to all open crates, or would then closed crates? So the variability that exists in the crating industry might create some complications there as well. So that just might be some future work involved with that. But I just know that there are so many different kinds out there that it would be difficult to understand where one code should apply and where it shouldn't. So that certainly presents a challenge from that perspective. There's another question: what is the max height of storage of recycled pallets? It doesn't matter if it's a new pallet or a recycled pallet, the code's the same. It's a max height. There's no distinction in the code for that. It's still 20 feet.
And remember, there's a 20 foot, but if you go to 20 foot, then there's additional separation requirements because You're going to be at 0.75 times the height of that stack. So you've got to figure out what works best for your site. Again, we put 20 foot in there because that's kind of deals with some operational considerations. If you have limited area on site, that 20 foot might not work when it requires you now to be further from the property line.
Next question. This came in after the raw material question, but it refers to cut stock. And so for those less familiar with the pallet industry, the industry deals with different types of raw material. So cut stock meaning it's pre-manufactured components, so deck boards and stringers, and just stacked up together. As Bill described very well, presents a different fire opportunity. I think this idea of cut stock falls back into this, all grouped into raw material in general. Another question: are the majority of manufacturers members of NWPCA? I can answer that answer is no. Right now, NWPCA membership is composed of both U.S. domestic and international manufacturers and recyclers, as well as companies that service the industry, who manufacture equipment for the industry. There are roughly about 400 manufacturers and recyclers that are members of NWPCA in the U.S. The difficult part about getting around the answer to this question is it can be difficult to identify a company based on NAICS codes and things like that. But to our best estimates, we know that there can be up to several thousand companies. So the short answer is no. The minority of producers in the U.S. are members of the association. But as we mentioned, Bill and I both mentioned, we are doing a lot of outreach to non-members. There's there are a few publications in the realm of the pallet industry that we're partnering with that can reach non-members, and then a lot of our members also know people in the industry who are non-members, and so through those channels we're really working toward getting the word out.
And Brad, I know we've even had some inquiries from your international members who are not regulated by either of these codes, saying, is this something we could be doing in our area? Again, as a risk management best practice activity.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Another question: how does this code relate to my insurance? I can start with this one. And the answer is it really doesn't. I mean, there are components to this code that overlap with insurance. The Hot Works program just being one that comes to mind. I know a lot of insurance programs require that. There is no real connection between the two. But if your insurance is a private company, that's a private agreement between you and them. These codes are publicly enforced regulations that you can be enforced or that are enforced. So there's really no real connection between the two.
And while there's not a direct connection, as we've developed these requirements and we've done presentations at several NWPCA conferences, there are industry insurance representatives that are present at those presentations. So they've been following this activity as well. The only thing that I would add to what Brad said is, while there's not a direct connection, I am fairly confident that if you read your insurance policy, it will probably say that you need to operate your facility in compliance with all local, state, federal rules, regulations, etc. And there are at least certain aspects of the insurance industry in general. I won't speak to this particular aspect of the insurance industry, but there certainly are aspects of the insurance industry that they will look for every and any reason not to pay a claim. And if they have reason to believe that you're not complying with local codes, that may be a reason that they would decline a claim for loss.
Okay, thank you. Another question. This code is for outdoor storage of wood pallets. Why are indoor parts of my facility included in the code? You want to take that, or you want me to start with that?
Well, actually, the indoor areas would be covered by other sections of the code. However, the indoor operations are all part of the risk on the site. They are either the exposure risk if I have a fire in the outside storage, or they might be the risk of where the fire would start that might spread to the outside storage. So, I know I had slides of indoor areas. That's generically part of my risk assessment for the site. The woodworking area is covered by other provisions of the fire code. And I'll leave it at that, Brad.
Okay, great. And I think just to add is, because this is a performance-based standard, we're really looking at a holistic approach at fire safety. So it goes back to that core principle that we have about the importance of fire safety at the facilities. So yes, it's true the code applies specifically to outdoor storage, but again, fire safety starts really when you walk in the door of your facility. I have a question here about OSHA. OSHA does regulate, and if it regulates the industry, there are a lot of OSHA regulations in the industry related to worker safety. Bill had talked about a couple of them, but just operationally, OSHA inspects the industry in a similar manner than that the fire safety industry would inspect. So we also have a partnership with OSHA and working on improving worker safety at pallet facilities. So yes, there is a history of an OSHA presence in the industry. And I think we have time for, we're right at the 3 o'clock. I'm going to squeeze in one more question about, site effects of site topography, so site plans. So things like drainage and downstream runoff. And so, Bill, what do you think about that?
Yeah, we don't really require you to identify topography or landscaping or some of those other issues. I know that one of the sites I visited had a lot of well-grown trees all around the property line. And again, that could be an avenue by which the fire could spread. This is where your local fire inspector, again, can be a valuable resource to you. Topography is an issue. And, to the extent that you have some flexibility, again, maybe on a new lot as to where you locate the buildings as compared to where you locate the outside storage, that could all be taken into account. But at this point in time, we've not required topography or landscaping or anything like that be identified on the site plan.
Okay, excellent. Well, we're 1 minute past the hour, so we want to respect everyone's time and wrap things up for this afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance. You can feel free to reach out to me or Bill with any of your questions or follow-ups. Again, these materials will be available on our website at palletcentral.com, fire code safety. And again, thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, everyone.